Good evening, everybody, and thanks for coming. I was up in a faculty meeting this morning, as was Jonathan, and the faculty up there goes, "Why are you doing an event downtown so far away from Evanston on a Friday night? Why are you doing that?" And I said, "Well, because there's some hip and cool people in Chicago that are connected to the program, and this is a great way to start the weekend." So, Jonathan, thank you for helping to start our weekend off on such a great note. Jonathan is a faculty member teaches in San Francisco and Chicago, teaches MarTech and other things he can tell you about, and was former principal at Deloitte Consulting, CMO at Deloitte Consulting. The marketing budget, the content creation budget you had, I've heard, is incredible. So we're anxious to hear more about you and your book, and so thank you very much for investing your evening with us.
Well, thank you. So we're actually taping this thing, so normally I would move, but then I'm going to be out of the scope of the tape, so I'm going to stay somewhere in this range. So first of all, thank you very much for joining me on a Friday evening. I know that wine and couple beer, right, and some appetizers are small, recompense for giving up an hour of your time on Friday afternoon, Friday night. Thank you. I'm going to rush out no later than 7:30 because we've got tickets for Chorus Line at Porchlight. If anybody's seen Chorus Line there, if not, it's a great play there. It's got wonderful reviews at Porchlight Theater up on Dearborn. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted also to be able to talk about the book. Thank you to those of you who have bought copies of it. I'm more than happy to sign copies of them. If we sell all of our books, I think I may be able to get a cup of coffee at Starbucks. And if anybody ever wants to talk about what it's like to write a business book, more than happy to do so. I only found out recently, it's a very funny story. So this is a book which was done in conjunction with MIT Press and Sloan Management Review, which is published by MIT. So interesting enough, our editor at MIT Press and I went to the same undergraduate school, and the editor-in-chief of MIT SMR has his master's in science and journalism from a small journalism school in Evanston. So, be careful. You never know where people might turn up. But it's wonderful to be here, wonderful. So the book is called The Technology Fallacy, and the book is just published on April 16th. It was originally supposed to be April 23rd. For some reason, they moved it up a week. And I want to spend some time tonight talking about the book and what it's about and why I think it's worth a read of all of you. So I'm going to give you a little soundbite, and then I'll talk about the inspiration for the book, a little bit of the journey that we took in creating the book, and then more importantly, what we found from the research, and I'll explain what the research was, and then what I think it means for organizations who are undergoing digital disruption. Okay? Make sense? I promise, Marty, I will be done no later than 6:45. And so I had originally 157 slides. So I'm going to talk really quickly. No, I pared them down a little bit. But if anybody wants 157 slides, I'm more than happy to send them to you. Okay? So here's the deal. The deal is, how many people have heard the term digital disruption? Right? Okay. So we hear this term and we use it kind of loosely. And if I say, what does it mean? What does it mean?
Transforming your organization from analog to digital.
Okay. Seth?
What she said.
Michelle?
Someone else.
Denise? No, she's in one of my classes
I
now,
know.
so she better answer.
When you make things, oh gosh, now I'm on the spot.
Oh, and you're being streamed too.
Yeah, okay, so digital disruption, when you change the environment of what's happening in the world.
It dramatically transforms a business and how they operate at times, and it could be disrupted upon, or it could be the disruptor.
Okay, so look, and I tell students in the class, I'm going to pick on you again, Janine. So, we all have some device which looks like this. Probably. Anybody doesn't have a smartphone? Okay. So, Janine, what year was the iPhone launched?
2007.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so you were paying attention.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so look, if you go back in time 12 years and you think 2007, what was going on in 2007? All of a sudden, Apple announces that they're got this smartphone and what we're going to do with it. Now, I'm willing to bet that most of the people here, you spend less than 10% of your time, if even that much, using your smartphone as a phone. You may use it for texting, you may use it for looking up information, you may use it for reservations and so forth. And if you think about the businesses like Uber and Airbnb and all these other businesses that couldn't have existed without a smartphone. So to your point, I'm sorry, this is
Roseanne.
Oh, Roseanne. What Roseanne said is you can be the business that's disruptive or the business that's the disruptor, but we've created a whole set of new businesses that didn't exist 10, 15, 20 years ago. And if you go back in time further, it's not like it's just happened with digital, it's just as accelerated, right? So if we were sitting around in the early part of the 20th century, Marty and I can remember that, and we were looking at cars, right? So I was telling somebody earlier today, my mother-in-law, who died several years ago, she was born in 1911. She was born in her home in Puerto Rico, not that far from San Juan, and the midwife came to her house on a horse, 1911. Right? And then when she died 11 years ago, think about all the things that happened. Now, if we're sitting around in the early part of the 20th century, and we say, oh, there are these new things called cars, and they're disrupting transportation. And somebody may know the quote that Henry Ford once said, if you ask people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. But in fact, things have changed a lot because it's not just cars, because 1955, we built the interstate highway system, and the world has changed dramatically. So cars back in the day they were analog devices, but they fundamentally changed the way that we think about transportation. So you could commute from here to what we call half-day road. The reason why they call it half-day road was because it took us a half day to get from downtown Chicago out to Lincolnshire, where half-day road is. But it has that name. Only during rush hour. So here's what the book is about. Just because the digital technologies have created the disruptions that we see, what we have learned is it doesn't mean that implementing those digital technologies is the only solution that we have. Those are necessary but not sufficient conditions to respond to this pressure that we feel from digital technologies. In fact, the things which are really difficult are the cultural, the organizational, the process, the leadership changes that we need in organizations in order to respond to this. Right? So it's a little bit like if you give a kid a car, if any of you have kids who are old enough to drive, it's always a scary thought when they actually drive for the first time. It's not just that they need the car, they also need driving lessons, they need to understand the rules of the road, they need to understand safety and all those things. So the technology, the car is only part of solving the problem. Same thing with digital. Just giving things to people is just going to create a lot of confusion, cost, complexity in an organization as opposed to solving the problem. And what we know is if you just take those cutting edge technologies, you put them in organizations that are not prepared to deal with them, you're just going to create more consternation, more problems, more things stuck in those organizations that need to be solved. So that's it. The gist of the book is we really need to focus on the people side of digital as opposed to purely on the technology side. It's not that technology is not important, but if you just focus on technology, you're going to wind up spending a lot of money and not solving the problems that you were trying to solve and transform your organization. Now, anybody ever read this book or seen the movie Wizard of Oz?
Yes.
Okay. Anybody who hasn't? Anybody who hasn't heard of it? Roy, have you heard of it?
I haven't. I did not read the book.
Okay. So the book was written by L. Frank Baum. They made it into a movie. And anybody remember how the movie starts?
Black and white.
Yeah, it's more of a sepia tone, but black and
You're
white
right,
tone,
yes.
right?
Yes,
And
correct.
what's the pivotal event? there's a cyclone, right? So I'm going to just play you a clip. And I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but this is Dorothy, and she's in her house, and the cyclone has lifted up the house, and she's there with her dog. What's the name of the dog? Toto. Right. So this was the inspiration for the book, because in these sepia tones, and then all of a sudden she gets to Oz and the world changes color, right? She changes, everything around her changes, and she says to Toto, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore, right? And the point of this is that's kind of the world that we're in. You know, if we got in a time machine 10 years ago, came to the world of today, it would be very different than where we were 10 years ago. And I don't think it's that we haven't had transformation and disruption in the past, but the speed at which these things happen is just getting quicker, quicker, quicker. So that things that we could not have imagined a couple of years ago now seem, of course, it goes for granted. Right? We're going back and forth about how we're going to pay for books. In fact, cash, right? We need something else, so we have Venmo. But if you think about the idea of Venmo, the idea that you're going to get in a car with a stranger to go to Uber, you're going to rent a room in a house from a stranger at Airbnb, those are things were unimaginable. And some of the students who have taken my customer value innovation class know one of my favorite quotes is from the former Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, and she said, what once seemed impossible in retrospect seems inevitable. And what she meant by that, she talked about geopolitics, but I think it applies a lot to innovation, which is things which 10 years ago we could not have imagined. Now, of course, it makes sense. And it changes the way that we operate. So that was what inspired the book. Now, there's some research that went into this. This was about 4 or 5 years in the making. And it was a sponsorship that I started when I was at Deloitte with Sloan Management Review, which is published by MIT. And every year we went out and did surveys. And we surveyed roughly about 4,000 people a year around the world. So small companies, large companies, different sectors around the world. And every year we published a report. And these were the 4 years of the report. So we gathered over 4 years over 16,000 survey responses, which was longitudinal. And so you'll see in the book, there's a lot of charts and graphs. I'll show you some of them tonight, which is based on the research. Number two is we had over 157 countries represented here, and only about a third of those were US, the rest were global. So it's not just people in the greater area of Chicago, but it's a broad cross-section of companies, types of geographies represented, and more than 30 different industry sectors, of which about a third of them were companies over $1 billion in revenue. So a pretty diverse palette. And then we followed that up. We did 75 plus interviews with senior executives and leaders at market leading companies like Google, Marriott, Salesforce, Walmart, and so forth. So you'll see in the book, we kind of have a lot of vignettes in each of the chapters, really trying to illustrate with case studies some of the points that we found from the research. And then we did a lot of secondary research in psychology, organizational behavior, information sciences, and so forth. And there are 4 of us who worked on the book. 2 of them were former colleagues of mine from Deloitte. And then another was, where's Ram? Another was a former, is a professor at Boston College.
Sorry.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah.
Jim. So he teaches information sciences, Jerry Kane. So those were the 4 of us. So Jem is a former student of Jerry's from Boston College. And so delighted that you were able to join us tonight. So I'm going to give you a couple of highlights from the research. Number 1 is we asked companies to self-identify where they fell on the spectrum of digital maturity. And then we correlated with some of the characteristics. So what we discovered, roughly a little bit less than a third of the companies describe themselves as maturing, in the process of getting more mature, a little bit less than half developing, and about a quarter in the early stages. And we said, what's the major difference between working in a digitally mature company and working one more traditional one? And the biggest single factor that came out was the pace of business, the speed at which we operate. So 23%, these were unprompted, said pace of business. 19% said culture of mindset. 18% said the workplace. 16% said increased productivity. Now, you may notice none of them said technology. It wasn't until we got to the next one where they said improve access to use of tools. So, this was one of the first hints that we had was, this is not about better technology. It's about a different way of working, which the technology enables. The other thing is that we asked, what's the role of digital in your business? And for the people in the early stages, the most common response said digital is only talk. And some of you may work at companies or have been at companies where that's the case. People in the middle said we support some of our objectives. The people on the mature side said digital is a core part of our business. And it's interesting because even companies that historically have described themselves as being the automotive business or the manufacturing business and so forth, increasingly say our business is digital, even though they may be making jet engines or making cars and so forth. And if we think about the car manufacturing business, questions about whether Tesla will ultimately be successful, but that's a software business. If you have a Tesla, Marty probably drives a Tesla, I don't know. But they're downloading the new software to you on a regular basis the same way that Apple downloads the software to you on your phone. Is that a manufacturing business or a software technology digital business? The other thing they said is that digitally maturing organizations are more nimble. So there are 4 things that we looked at. They're all pretty highly correlated: agility, experimental, rewards collaboration, accepts risk of failure, organized around cross-functional teams. Well, they go up pretty highly correlated with the stage of maturity. And here what was interesting to us. So some of you in the audience are a little bit younger than my kids. Some of us are a little bit older. And interestingly enough, we said to people, how interested are you working for a digital leader? So not surprisingly, people are younger, 22 to 27, 28 to 35. By and large, over 90% of those people said they want to work for a digital leader. But if you look, and it's obscured because of this is the group which is 68 and over. Over 72% of those people want to work for digital leaders. So it's not just millennials. People in all age cohorts want to work for companies that are digital. And the thing they said is, if you're down here, remember these are the stages of digital maturity, but to the left is the less mature. The green line says, my organization's embrace of digital attracts new talent, and the people on the left-hand side, my organization needs a significantly new or different talent base to compete effectively. So people recognize that people don't want to come. So now we've got an issue which is not just about can we find the right technology. I teach a class in marketing technology that some of you have taken. It's not about optimizing your marketing. It's about optimizing your talent stack. Another thing is, we asked about what are the characteristics of digital maturity? Experimental, supportive, transparent. Those are all the kinds of ways that digital organizations operate. Once again, interesting enough, we asked people, what's your likelihood that you could leave your organization? People who felt that the company did provide great opportunities to operate in digital environments, those are the numbers at the top, 3%, 2%, 7%. Numbers below are the ones where they feel the digital environment was less than optimal. So people at the sales and staff level, 43% of those people say that they're likely to leave with. Now, if you're the CEO of a company like that, you should be scared. Right? And there's an old joke, well, what if we take all those people and train them and they leave? Somebody else says, what if we don't train them, they stay? Right? Because we need a different kind of talent. Many of you are in the program here at Medill, and part of what we're trying to do is to train people. But if I look and say, do you want to go work for a digital laggard or digital leader? Most people probably say you want to be with a digital leader. Now, you may be stuck at digital laggard temporarily, but that's not what your aspiration is. So how do companies which are laggards become leaders? Now, here's the other thing which was interesting, was 87% of the companies that we spoke to said that they felt that their industries and their companies and their sectors are going to be disrupted by digital technology. So it's not that people didn't know, not that they have their, blinded to the fact that digital disruption is going to happen. 44%, though, felt that their companies were not doing an adequate job of responding. So there's what industrial psychologists would call this knowing-doing gap. We know we got a problem, but we are not doing enough about it. And interestingly enough, this was particularly prompted at at the employee level, because once again, this is early to maturing. So employees were much more satisfied at digitally mature companies. The ones who were at the early ones were dissatisfied. Now, the other thing which was interesting to us was CEOs felt that they were doing much better than the line employees. Now, why is that? Because they've been listening to all these, rosy stories about how good things are in their companies and all the wonderful stuff, but the average employee actually who deals with customers and deals with supply chain and deals with all these things says maybe it's not quite as rosy as the CEO thinks. So there's not only this knowing-doing gap, but there's a gap between what the senior executives and what the line employees think as well in terms of the degree to which they are digitally mature. And we asked people about, what's getting in the way? And it's this notion of willing to take risks, this ability to deal with ambiguity and change. Finding the right technology is important, but not as important as those other things. And the rest of the things all have to do with work structure, team structure, and so forth. When we ask about leaders, what do they want from leaders? People who have this experimentation mindset. People who are willing to take risks. People who are willing to speak out. People who are willing to be challenging. People who were confident taking the lead. People who had a vision and communicate that vision effectively to people. So, next remaining 17 minutes, I'm going to tell you what we think should be done about it. And it falls into 4 buckets. And there's a lot of detail in the book about what these things are. And I'm going to use 4 terms. And I'm going to quickly explain what these terms are. And you'll see in the book we give lots of case studies. So the first term is this thing called absorptive capacity. And what that refers to is the speed at which organizations actually can adopt new technology. The second is something called affordances. And affordance is the ability to recognize a value in a particular technology. Third thing is actually creating a digital talent magnet. How do we deal with the fact that so many people don't want to work for these laggards? And the last one, which is I'll call digital agility, is this notion about test fast, learn fast, and scale fast. And it's a mindset, right? So, certainly in IMC, we talk a lot about test and learn. This notion that we can get faster and faster about testing, faster and faster about learning, and faster about scaling. So, let me go through each one of these quickly. Absorptive capacity. So it's a term which explains the rate at which organizations can identify and assimilate new innovation. It's a learned capability. Right? So if you go to digitally mature organizations, what we've learned they have is people who say, oh, let's try this thing out, let's use it, let's implement it. so forth, because they recognize the value and capabilities of this. Now, it's a little bit like if you've never seen or somebody shows you something, you haven't seen it, you've never had experience, it's pretty hard to recognize it. So organizations which have a lot of absorptive capacity when it comes to new technology are able to take in new technologies, but the more that you use it, the better you get at absorbing new things. A little bit like, you take baby steps and then we can run and so forth. So it becomes sort of a doom loop if you don't have the capabilities to understand this new technology, and it's a virtuous loop if you do, because then you get better and better over time, right? So you learn by doing. So, we talk a lot at Northwestern about diversity and inclusion. Marty and I were at a faculty meeting this morning. We talked about diversity and inclusion. We generally tend to think about diversity and inclusion as gender, ethnicity, race, all kinds of things like that. But diversity and inclusion has to also be about people with different skill sets. How do we get people who may look different than us? Because if we all have the same experiences, we're not going to learn from one another. So how do we create that diversity, which may mean, people who don't necessarily all have master's or undergraduate degrees from top universities. It may mean people who have very different experiences. And how do we get those people and combine those people creatively in the environment? Second is, how do we teach people digital skills? And, I'll talk a little bit about this in a second, but the idea that we actually, as an organization, people come to organizations because they want to learn. And people will leave organizations because they're not learning. And this is something which, in the old days, I started working. You went to an organization, it was a good place to work. Good place to work meant you didn't get fired, you had a pension when you retired, you could stay there for 30 or 40 years, you moved up and so forth. Well, that's not true anymore. We all move around now in 2, 3, 4, 5-year cycles. Somebody who's been somewhere for 20 years, that's very uncommon. So how do these, you make these things, the volatility of the learning experience better? Number 3 is you have to always be looking outside at what stuff are other people doing, not just in your industry, but in other industries as well. And then, how do you get things communicated within an organization? How do you improve the velocity? Oh, those people over there are doing interesting stuff. So in the old days, when we all physically co-located, you walk down the hall, bump people in the water cooler, you talk about what you're doing and say, oh, that's kind of neat. It's much harder to do in a virtual environment that many of us work in because you don't have those serendipitous encounters that allow you to exchange information. So now we're all on phone calls, and we've got phone calls at half-hour blocks, and we get on the phone call, and like the best thing about a phone call is when it ends a couple seconds early, because then you could go to the bathroom, right? So figuring out ways to get us more collaborative, tools like Slack and Chatter in the old days for Salesforce are some of the ways that people are trying to do that. But how do we get better at doing that informal exchange, which is not necessarily need to know, but when you start to know it, then it helps you to be better. And then the last thing is, it's so important for leaders. We were just talking a second ago, as we were during cocktails, about how leaders have to say why. People need to know why it's so important for us to become more digital. Okay, so that's the first thing, getting that absorptive capacity. Second is about affordances. Now, the term affordances refers, it's a management term of art, but we call it digital affordances, the ability to recognize what the capability is of a particular technology. Now, you may say, well, that's pretty clear. I buy something and I know what it is. So, imagine, years ago, Twitter is introduced. Anybody here use Twitter? Everybody knows what it is. Now, we went back in time 15 years and said, who would have imagined that we'd have a president of the United States who's figured out how to weaponize Twitter? Right? Now, regardless of your politics, he's found a way to use that in a way which is very different than what it was originally intended to use. So he discovered an affordance of that technology. The United States Geological Survey is an organization part of the U.S. government. Among other things is that they track earthquakes. What they've discovered is that people in earthquakes will tweet. And they're able to use the geolocators in Twitter to identify where those earthquakes are. And it's much more accurate than the physical sensing equipment that they had around the country. Right? Would have imagined that. And the answer is, we could have imagined it's only by using this stuff over time that people have figured out, oh, that would be a neat thing to do. So things get used in very different ways than they may have originally intended. So we have a whole chapter in the book about duct tape. Right? I presume knows what duct tape is, right? So the original purpose of duct tape, it was invented during World War II for military applications. And then after, and it was by Johnson & Johnson. That was the company that invented it. And then they took duct tape and repurposed duct tape. And the reason why it's called duct tape, it's D-U-C-T, not D-U-C-K. The reason why it's called duct tape, anybody know?
Ducks.
Yeah. So in an HVAC system, you've got all these air ducts, right? And they could potentially leak, so you wrap the duct tape around the air vents, right? Now, nowadays, you don't use duct tape for it, you use HVAC tape, but that was the original intention. Now, I bet many of you probably have duct tape, right? Have you put together any ducts with your duct tape?
I have not.
Okay.
Plenty of packages or other things.
We wrap packages. You could go to the internet. You could look up, uses for duct tape, and you'd find like all these books about making Halloween costumes, and so forth. There's actually a series of videos on YouTube called the Duct Tape Challenge. Some of these things are violent and obscene, so I did decide not to show them. But people have found new affordances associated with duct tape. Everything from removing warts to, it's funny, 2.5 years ago, I had the opportunity to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. And before I went to Kilimanjaro, I was on a plane, and I was talking to a guy. He had climbed Kilimanjaro. He says, don't forget to bring duct tape. It's like, I'm climbing a mountain. Why do I need duct tape? He said, just trust me on this one. First night we're in, we've got these pumps to pump up the tents. Apparently the pump was leaking. The guy who was our guide, who was from Arusha in Tanzania, where we were, comes running up to us and says, does anybody have duct tape? I do. So I wrote a little blog entry after I got back from Kilimanjaro. You could all read it on LinkedIn. It's called Don't Forget the Duct Tape. Right? But it's one of these things like who would have known. So the chapter, which is called The Duct Tape Guide to Strategy, Digital Strategy, and it's available on the Deloitte site, so you can download it for free if you didn't buy the book, is about this notion of that we find these things, and we find them because of we put them into use, and then we find things that we can do with them. So we use a case study with KLM in the book, and KLM, which has been very clever at finding new ways to use Twitter. So they originally started Twitter purely as a promotional thing, sent out cute tweets, but then they discovered it was actually a very good way for them to track luggage. And it's become a way for them to have lost and found and communicate with people, but also people who find somebody else's luggage and then put things in Twitter as well. So who would have thought about it? The answer is you wouldn't have thought about it except if you start to use it and then somebody says, maybe I could try this and that. So teaching organizations how to be nimble and flexible about that. Third thing is about talent, right? And I said a couple of times, people want to learn, and they want to learn how to be more digital. And so people will go to organizations and they'll ask the question about learning. The biggest employer right now at Kellogg of graduating MBAs, it used to be the consulting firms, it used to be the investment banks, it's Amazon. And if you ask students at Kellogg why they want to go to Amazon, it's not because it's a great place to work, because the reputation that Amazon is not a great place to work. People say, because I think I'll learn quicker. Okay? So once again, that's a new thing for us. So how do we actually get people to figure out how to have the opportunities to learn? And learning is not just going to classes. Learning is on the job learning is learning from your peers and so forth. And MetLife, which is one of the case studies that we have, has created this whole employee development fund. But one of the things that they've used is digital technology to create a learning platform for an employee to figure out how to do these things. But it also means looking beyond the usual suspects from a hiring standpoint. It means, we were just talking about, so Anthony and I were talking about, he works for Jim Beam, right? So Jim Beam, I remember, was in Deerfield. Well, it's in the merchandise market. And guess what? Who else is in the city, right? Walgreens is in the city, McDonald's is in the city, Caterpillar is in the city, ADM is in the city. Why? Because that's where the smart, talented digital people are. They're not out in Deerfield. They're not out in Peoria. They're not out in Decatur, right? So now we have to think, we think this thing that we did years and years ago where we built these great big facilities like Sears, which was out in Hoffman Estates. Anybody know where Hoffman Estates is? Really far, right? People don't want to go out there. Sorry. Right, so, but the other thing is that we have to figure out how to create more porous, organizations. How do we let people go from one part of the organization to another part of the organization? How do we let people be on teams? And one of the things that came up in our interviews, people really enjoyed the opportunity to work on task forces and teams and so forth, because once again, it's about learning. So learning, as I said, it's about hard and soft skills. It's constant. People say that they want to update their skill bases. It's not just people, those of you who are in the IMC program and those of you who are graduating soon, that, okay, well, that's good. You're done with the degree, but then what do you do next? And the answer is, you can't stop learning, because the skills, the capabilities that you're going to need over the next 10, 20 years are very different than the skills that we just finished teaching you in the IMC program. And, so there's these experiential, exploratory, informal examples of how people learn are as important as the stuff that goes on in classrooms, and that's what people are looking for in places where they work. Then the very last thing is this notion of testing. All right, so I grew up years ago in the direct marketing environment. I worked for Time Incorporated, the magazine publishing company. Anybody know what a magazine is? These things that we used to print. Actually, our fulfillment center was 540 North Fairbanks, right, at Fairbanks in Ohio. And that's where we had our telemarketing capabilities, and that's where we sent things out. So we would send out these things called business reply. Well, people, in our magazines, we'd have these little cards, BRCs and BREs and business reply cards, and we'd have a little key on each one of these cards, and we'd put these codes on, and the key code, then we would key into our systems, and we'd look at it and say, which offer worked better, which editorial content works better, and so forth, and have people respond. So typically we'd run these tests, and it would take us 2-3 months to analyze the results and say, oh, this is the better offer to make, let's continue to do that. And we went through this A/B testing, this is back in the early 1980s. But we can do A/B testing now, and students in my marketing technology class know, like literally, multiple A/B tests in a single day with better results and much bigger samples. Right? So we can automate all those things. And so one question is, how do we learn how to test fast? Because now we can not just test, simple, offers. We can test a lot of different things, whether it's landing pages, but we can also test things about how things operate. How does this new customer-facing process operate? How can we test things about, this new product idea, so forth. We've got to learn, but we've got to learn to test small. Right? I'm sure all of you are familiar with the problems that Boeing 737 MAX had. You think, how could that happen? An organization as big, complicated, sophisticated as Boeing. And then you read the reports, it's like they didn't test it enough. They didn't have enough points where they educate people and so forth. But you don't start by building the plan and say, now let's test it. You got to test pieces. But how do you test small? And how do you test enough? Right? Because you can't just do one test and say, okay, now we're done. So a lot of agile marketing is really about this notion of testing quickly, testing enough, and so forth. And then how do we learn about this in the organization? One of the big differences that we discovered between digital mature and immature organizations is that digitally mature organizations do a much better job of taking news and spreading it, taking those institutional learnings and making them institutional as opposed to confining them within. Now, all of you, I'm sure, have heard the terms like fail fast, fail forward, and so forth. I hate those terms. The reason why I hate those terms is most organizations do not reward failure. Now, if you disagree with me, why don't you try failing in your organization and see if it gets rewarded? But yet we say that those are important things to do. What we really actually want is to learn stuff. And that's a little bit different than failure, because, and failure may be fine in a startup organization where you rapidly prototype and so forth, but if you're an established organization, you need things which help you get better at the next thing. And it's a little bit different than failure. It's about learning fast and then taking those things and propagating those into the next cycle and the next iteration. And that's what digitally mature organizations do very well. And even organizations like Google, which is composed primarily of digital natives, we interviewed them. They're talking about something called the Accelerated Mobile Pages Project. And the mantra at Google is very much, you better learn something from everything you do. And then make sure the rest of the organization understands that as well. So, what do digital organizations do well? They do 4 things very well. One is that they have the ability to take new technology, deploy it, learn it, use it, and they get better at that. So the more that they do, the better they get. So, I tell students in the marketing technology class, you got to start somewhere. If you sit around and try to optimize, your technology stack and so forth, you're going to lose some ground. You just got to start somewhere. And if you try something and it doesn't work, then you're smarter for the next thing that you're going to pick. Second thing is you've got to get good at spotting these uses. So you've got to try a lot of pilots, a lot of experiments. And some stuff won't work as well as you thought. And I used the example the other day. I used to be on the board for WBZ, which is our NPR affiliate here in Chicago. And we tried a number of years ago doing podcasts. And they just didn't work. And when I say they didn't work, nobody listened to them. So we said, well, okay, let's stop doing the podcast. And then one of our big shows is This American Life. Anybody listen to This American Life?
Yes.
Great show. So we did a podcast for something called Serial. Anybody listen to Serial?
Yep.
Well, so did over 1 million other people. And I said, well, wait a second. They figured out how to do it. Maybe the problem was not the podcast. Maybe the problem was, we were a little bit too early, but maybe the problem was content wasn't interesting. So how do we figure out how to make the content more interesting? And we said, well, let's take a cue from the pages of NPR. And we actually decided to do it like an NPR radio show. We went out and we hired, we actually auditioned NPR talent, people who were broadcasters in NPR. We hired a woman called Tanya Ott, who was a NPR stringer. And so we made these things look and sound more like NPR because that's what people are listening to. And then it evolved this over time. So you've got to try these things and see if they work and don't work. So I was very big on, in my job at Deloitte, about learning pilots. And everything we do needs to be purposeful about learning something. What will we learn from it, good or bad? And then how do we take that thing and roll it into the next thing that's bigger? Look, many of you who are still in the program, you're going to go out, either stay in your jobs, look for different jobs, change jobs, and so forth. But, how do we, if you're a legacy organization, how do you get the top talent? Whether it's from Kellogg, from Medill, from, our undergraduate programs and so forth, because we're competing against, the cooler, sexier organizations. And, we're talking about the Google facility and the garage doors that open up and so forth. That's what people are looking for. It's not just the cool places in terms of the environment, but this notion that you could learn more. And then the very last thing is, how do we get to be more agile with this, taking the test and learn capabilities that we emphasize so much in this program and making those part of the, taking them beyond marketing, making part of the fabric. So that's what the book is about. We've got 16,000, responses that you'll see up the wazoo. Lots of charts and graphs and so forth. We've got these interviews and case studies, and then we've got a couple of concepts. But the key thing to all of this is this notion that the world of digital disruption is not going to come to an end. It's only going to accelerate. And things that we think today, those are not big deal things, are going to be fundamentally disruptive over the next couple of years. My current thing that some of you have taken the class know, this is voice technology, right? So these conversational platforms like Alexa, Google Assistant, and so forth, I think are radically going to change not only marketing, but lots of other parts of the enterprise. So, we can, debate that sometime over a couple of years, but, I tell clients of mine, if you have not figured out a way to test voice, you better figure that out, because guess what? There are hundreds and hundreds of applications which are out there, which companies, CPG companies, B2B companies, manufacturing companies, technology companies are all testing out right now. You know, we were talking a little bit before the break about telecom. We're going to live in a 5G world, you know, which is very different than the 2G world that I can remember. So that's going to radically change things. We're living in a world of visual search, not just voice search, and not just text search, but visual search, right? So right now, you can go and you can, you know, look at somebody's, you know, article of clothing, say, I like that, where to come from now, I want to order it. So these things are all around, but they're going to continue to change what we operate. So we got to be pretty, as leaders, managers, employees, we've got to be pretty agile about testing, learning, and doing these things. And we can't wait any longer because the time period has compressed for these things. So what used to, you know, we used to be able to say, oh, we'll wait, we'll be a fast follower. It's very hard to be a fast follower right now because by the time you're ready to be a fast follower, somebody else has already usurped these. And Roseanne said, you know, this notion of, you know, you can either be disrupted or you can be the ones who is a disruptor. And I think that, you know, we're watching more and more of these large companies getting toppled by new technologies. And I'd say it's not because they're not smart, it's not because they don't anticipate, it's because they haven't built the kind of talent infrastructure that needs to be successful. So I went a little bit longer. Marty, thank you so much. Happy to answer any questions now or over cocktail, so thank you so much. Before we break, any questions for me? Yes.
I do have very specific. Going through organization, digital disruption, and a lot of technologies, automations being introduced, and I am on the team. And I am facing a challenge because this is cool, and let's talk about the technology and all of these things. And what I'm saying is our main audience are these scared employees who are concerned about their job. I'm trying to find that happy medium to, you know, to talk about what benefits they could have. Now, I know that's always a tightrope, right? Because automation and technology usually means tightening of the workforce, or at least major changes. Have you found any places that have really done that internal communication well, and they've addressed it? Or
So we have a couple of case studies, and there's a whole chapter on the future of the workplace and the impact of technology. So you can get more details there. But and
it's in the book.
It is. But what the kind of the quick version of it is, people are looking for vision. You know, they're looking for the person, you know, not to get overly religious about this, but the person who's going to take them to the promised land. They want to believe that that person can do it in the same way that, you know, Moses, you know, convinced all these Israelites to go, you know, leave Egypt and go somewhere else, you know, under, you know, the worst of circumstances. So people want that. But they also want people, you know, if the leaders are not consistent with, you know, what they're saying, you know, people's crap detectors are pretty good. So if, you know, one of the things I tell people who are in leadership, you know, you kind of have to walk the walk, talk the talk. Right? So I remember the old days when, you know, you'd have leaders who were printing out all their emails so they could read them. Now, not that many people do that, but you do need to get the leaders to be sufficiently technology savvy so that it's not something which feels distant, because otherwise people will uncover. And the reality is, look, a lot of jobs will be eliminated. You know, there's all kinds of research about what kind of so forth, but, you know, people believing that there's a vision that they can aspire to, and a leader is equipped to take them there is the single biggest thing.
And I think my challenge is the tagline of you're able to focus on what matters. That sounds good, but people want details. So, you know, what does that mean? You know, and give me some specifics for some roles, even one example, just to say this is how we're going to shift things, and that's not forthcoming.
So take a look at the chapter.
Okay.
There's
Thank you.
Another question back there? Yeah.
A question for you. The absorptive capacity, that seems like something that's rooted in more about a cultural element. So if what can you, as maybe a mid to new manager level, what can you do to help to influence the absorption capacity of your organization? I feel like people aren't quite catching on quick enough.
So, absorptive capacity exists at the individual and right. So we as individuals have, our absorptive capacity in institution, absorptive capacity is a composite of all these. So the first thing I'd say is you're responsible to yourself to figure out ways that you can increase your own absorption. It means you're a always on learning mode. Like it stops here. That's number two is, I think, helping your leaders look for ways to have tests, experiment, things that change. And maybe try this, or this is what I saw. And my advice to people is, if they're in an environment where the answer is always no, don't have time to do that, and so forth, that might be a strong signal. Because, look, companies that have that kind of culture, I just don't. We've seen companies topple, right? And you don't want to be in a company that's toppling over. And I went to the first place, and companies around for 50 years. And this is wonderful. The companies that are wonderful places to work do exist. They just another 10 years. So I think if I were in younger part of my career, I'd say I better be working that is on the side of this. I don't want to be. It's like musical chairs. Music stops, and I don't want to be one who. Question.
You mentioned Google and Amazon. Are there any other situations that you think they kind of top of?
No, look, I mean, there's a number of case studies that we have in the book I just mentioned. Marriott, I think, is actually doing something very interesting. For example, they've experimented. Recently redesigned because of merger with Starwood, their whole frequent guest book. They've just announced that they're getting into a business directly with Airbnb. So yeah, I do, but if you, I'm unfortunate because the current leader just. But heard him speak, and he is the person who you said, I want to call that guy. Funny, he's smart, he is just incredibly thoughtful, and if you're in a room with that person, I was in a small room with him, and in a very large room with a group of 6,000 people, and he just radiated vision. So that would be an example of another company. So look, I mean, I think there are companies that are many more who are struggling with it. General Motors, is struggling. What will they look like? In the next generation. I think Mary Barra, who's the leader there, is pretty visionary and charismatic as well. But there's a lot of baggage that she inherited that she kind of has to sort through. I think she's been pretty good under the circumstances. But then there's companies which are the startup companies like Uptake here, which are just like, oh, those are so cool, even though they're industrial things. And I think companies like Caterpillar and so forth. I'll take one more question. Yes.
I was interested, you mentioned that it's not so much about your marketing and technology stack and advancing that, but the talent. Is there any advice you have or recommendations you have about the hard skills that either we could develop that talent or that we should be looking for?
Well, look, I think some of the things that we teach in the program, right? Certainly, the analytics side. I think, look, most of you will never have to code. Given what we talked about before, maybe. But I do think it's worthwhile for people to learn to code so they understand the process, even if they never do it. I think, things, learning. I taught myself last summer how to program a chatbot. And I did not because I'm going to make a living programming chatbots. Believe me, I won't. But just understand what was involved because I was doing research around conversational platform. I said, I want to understand how this works because I'm tired of
Like
talking
having to
about.
depend on someone.
Yeah. So I think we need to kind of do. Erica was in my class in San Francisco. We just did a little thing with learning how to do a skill for Alexa. Just stuff like that. So I would highly encourage you to, do some of the nitty gritty stuff because if you're, and regardless what level you're at, because if you're only talking about it, there's a real risk that, it fails the test of authenticity.
Right.
And when you say, oh yeah, we could do this with, and that person has never done it. Look, I'll give you an analog example. To do some consulting work with one of the automobile companies. And, the CEO would talk about making the deal experience better and so forth. Well, that guy had never bought a car from a dealer. Because every time you need a new car, the car would, he'd say to somebody and the car would show up in the garage. Right? Because it just came right from the factory. So he couldn't in any meaningful way talk about this. And by contrast, regardless of what you think about McDonald's, every executive at McDonald's used to have to spend time working in a restaurant. They had to go to McDonald's University, they had to work in the restaurant, they had to do the grill, everything else like that. Why? That's not because that was the future thing. A friend of mine was general counsel for McDonald's. I don't think, grilling hamburgers was his future. Apparently he wasn't very good at it. But it gave him a level of empathy stuff which gets you closer to real stuff, I think is real important, both technical skills like coding,
Right.
but also things that bring you in touch with the customer. If you've never worked in a call center, I'd say find a way to spend a day in a call center. And you'll be glad that you're getting a master's. Right? Because it's not great work to do. But hey, guess what? Organizations, if you've never worked in a factory, I did consulting work years ago at Land's End. This is before they were acquired by Sears and before they were spun off. Every executive at Land's End in busy season was in the warehouse fulfilling orders. And that gave them a level of empathy and sort of understanding the work so they could meaningfully talk about it in a way where they were talking about change management, which was meaningful to the people that they were trying to lead.
Right.
So technical skills that bring you in touch with customers, and skills that are really about the operational side of the business and the things that really make things work. Because if you're only sort of operating at this level, you're not going to understand the complexity that goes into, whether it's getting a meal on a table or getting a hotel room ready or getting a package shipped. That's the stuff that, we still live in a world, while a lot of it's digital, there's still a lot of analog parts of it that we have to manage. So anyway, thank you very much. Happy to talk to people some more.